am Janice Switlo, and I'm continuing now with part 16 of my book, Cede 2.0, dealing with the First Nation Land Management Act regime. Beginning on page 63, the FNLMA regime requires the, quote, First Nation, end of quote, to cover the costs of managing fiscal contributions by the federal government in amounts only as successive federal governments might decide. Where there are treaties requiring the Crown to administer the reserves, the Crown is responsible for those costs, and that is not subject to decision by successive federal governments. It is a constitutional requirement, as the federal governments are constitutionally bound by treaties. To be clear, I'm not talking about some mere Aboriginal right as defined by the Section 35 Constitution Act 1982 doctrine. I am talking about how treaties provide the very constitutional foundation that allows for the existence of Crown governments in Canada. This is new fiscal uncertainty, something provincial municipalities struggle with. Quote, because local governments are legally subordinate to provincial governments, the only sources of authority and revenue available to municipalities are those that are specifically granted by provincial legislation. The scope of provincial control over municipalities is largely unfettered, and municipal responsibilities can be altered by votes of the provincial legislature. Provincial grants are given with strings attached in the form of conditions that govern how the money will be spent. The conditions placed on provincial money mean that municipalities are limited in their ability to spend their grants for locally determined purposes, but must make choices that meet provincial policy goals. This situation has become increasingly difficult for municipalities. If provincial priorities or federal funding suddenly change, a municipality has very little room to maneuver between its existing financial obligations and the need to provide new services or to maintain existing services with reduced funds. For many years, municipalities have complained about the restrictions on their decision-making, local autonomy, and revenue, and have tried to find alternatives. As the growing urban centers came to play a more important role in the life of the nation, municipalities felt increasingly fettered by the unilateral control of the provinces. It is not likely that calls for constitutional recognition of municipalities and guarantees of fiscal security are going to die down in the near future. And that I was quoting from Michael Dewing and William R. Young, Political and Social Affairs Division, Aaron Tully, Economics Division, quote, Municipalities, the Constitution, and the Canadian Federal System from the Library of Parliament, revised in May 2006. Provincial municipalities would scratch their heads trying to understand why some Indigenous people would want to terminate the guarantees of fiscal security regarding reserve management contained in the treaties to end up mirroring their municipal situation of fiscal uncertainty through lack of constitutional protections. If you are a national of a continuing Indigenous nation reading this or listening to this, particularly one who has provided permissions to the Crown through treaty, continue to read Cede and my following comments carefully, and I would recommend doing so also in concert with the statement I wrote dated December 9, 2004, titled Indigenous Nations Understanding Self-Government. I actually provide that in part 1 of this series. Because the other big push underway is to get you to pass a constitution. Many are busy crafting a constitution, though not currently pursuing the FNLMA initiative. Especially to those Indigenous nationals having treaties with the Crown, even if you are not contemplating the FLNMA, remember, there is more than one way to piece together a monster. Of course, when I say treaty, I am not speaking about final land claims settlement agreements. Those are implemented by federal legislation, which incorporate new First Nations, mere creatures of law. But an Aboriginal group, the latest incarnation, now a globally agreed to term of how to reference domestic ethnic minorities of a certain kind, dare I say, the latest crop of apples, can of course put on and wear a blanket of assimilation at any time, though no one can force you to do so. You can be told how wonderful that blanket is and be told it is magical and unique, and also be told you will never know just how special it is until you try it on. Don't be chicken, you may be prodded. But know this, once you put it on, it stays on, even if you thought there was no harm in trying it on. There is a huge difference between being forced to wear a blanket you never asked for nor wanted, that has stifled and interfered with your very ability to live and prosper, i.e. the Indian Act and predecessor legislation and regulations, and asking for a blanket and with full consent putting it on yourself. For example, opting in supra-Indian Act legislation like the FNLMA. The former is unlawful and can threaten the peace, where there are continuing nations and treaties, but the latter is perfectly lawful.